Okay, so let's get started. Lots of information to talk about today. So the first thing, go over the agenda real quick. So introductions, which we just did. I'm going to talk about what CJIS is for those of you who don't know or may have heard of it, but are not really sure what it is. Talk about CJI and CHRI. A lot of terminology in here that I just want to make sure folks understand before I actually get into the policy areas. So I'm also going to talk about who CJIS applies to, why CJIS is important. The core of this presentation is going to be talking about the policy areas, which is why I indicated you might want to grab your coffee. There's a lot there. I broke out cloud computing, so I'm going to talk a little bit more about that. And then at the end, there's some resources and useful links, and then we'll open it up to questions. So that said, Compass was founded in 2010. We're a nationwide leader in providing IT security compliance and risk management services to organizations of all different facets. And our mission remains the same: to partner with your organization to help you mitigate your overall information security risk while providing you with the best customer service possible. Oops, went ahead. Okay, so let's get started. So what is CJIS? It stands for Criminal Justice Information Services, otherwise defined as CJIS. You're going to hear a lot of terminology throughout this presentation. So the first few slides are going over some of this terminology just to acclimate you to some of the words I'm going to be using. So back in 1992, the FBI actually established this CJIS division, and they serve as the focal point in the central repository for all types of criminal justice information, otherwise termed CJI. So you'll be hearing me use that term throughout the presentation. The CJIS division has management responsibility for day-to-day operations of several different databases. So what you see on the screen here, these are the various databases that they have responsibility for. I'm not going to go into these in any great detail, but I will explain what these are very briefly, just so you have an idea of what I'm talking about. So NGI stands for Next Generation Identification, and this provides the criminal justice community with an electronic repository of things like biometrics and criminal history information. It also includes something called the Wrap Back service, which allows authorized agencies to receive notification of activity on individuals who they may have done a background check on before. So if there's something that pops up, they don't have to redo the background investigation. It will automatically pop up under this Wrap Back service. And that's basically to allow authorized agencies to receive notification of activity on individuals who hold positions of trust. So think of like maybe school teachers or daycare workers, things like that. Or for those who are under criminal justice supervision or investigation. Thus, it eliminates that need for repeated background checks, as I mentioned. NDEX stands for National Data Exchange. LEAP is Law Enforcement Enterprise Portal. And these last few here are probably more important or more of interest to non-criminal justice agencies. But this one here, it's called III. It stands for Interstate Identification Index. And that's a national index of criminal histories, or otherwise known as rap sheets, as you may have heard it. And this also includes the National Fingerprint File, which is an index that holds millions of fingerprint identification cards for criminals who have committed a serious enough crime to go to jail for over 24 hours. Now, these last three, these are typically accessed when a background check is initiated. So these are three different databases. The NCIC is the National Crime Information Center, and that's a computerized index of criminal justice information. So it contains things like information on criminal record history information, stolen properties, missing persons, things of that nature. And that's typically available to federal, state, and local law enforcement and other types of criminal justice agencies when background checks are conducted. It's often referred to as the lifeline of law enforcement. So if you've ever heard of NCIC, that's what that stands for. Another database that's typically accessed for background checks is this NICS. It's the National Instant Criminal Background Check System, and that offers background checks on people who want to own firearms or explosives. And then lastly, we have the UCR, which is the Uniform Crime Reporting, which provides law enforcement with data for use in things like budget formulation, resource allocation, assessment of police operations. There's a lot of information contained in that, but the purpose of that is to help address the crime problem at various levels. What we're going to be focusing on today is the CSP, or the Criminal Justice Information Services Policy. I promised you there's going to be a lot of acronyms in here, and there are. So the CSP provides guidance for pretty much, it's the entire life cycle of any CJI, any criminal justice information, from inception through destruction. The CSP itself includes 13 policy areas, which I'm going to talk about in a little bit. But I just wanted to give you some basic background. Now, one interesting thing to note is that the CJIS policy itself, it's based on presidential directives, federal laws, other FBI directives, and a lot of the guidance comes from NIST. So once we get into the policy areas, some of this may be familiar to you. What's probably not familiar is a lot of this different terminology. But a lot of it is based on the NIST best practices. Okay, so let's talk about CJI and CHRI. So CJI refers to all of the FBI CJIS provided data necessary for law enforcement and civil agencies to perform their duties. If you're looking for, for background checks for civil agencies or law enforcement, obviously many different things that they would use the CJIS databases for. So CJI, criminal justice information, includes things like arrest reports, fingerprint data, criminal background checks, license plate numbers, all of that type of thing. And then there's something called criminal history record information, otherwise referred to as CHRI. And that is a subset of criminal justice information. It's typically referred to as restricted data. And that includes a lot of information about a person, a certain individual's contact with law enforcement agencies. So restricted files that need to be protected as CHRI are things like you can see on the screen here. So gang files, violent person files, identity theft files, a lot of information, suspected terrorist files. So it goes a little bit deeper, a lot of information included in here. So in short, the answer basically is if you receive information from State Bureau investigation organizations or the FBI, you're likely bound by CJIS requirements. Now, as I mentioned, CHR is a subset of CJI. So CHRI might contain some information that is also available through public records, but typically information from these systems and databases is not public record. However, all of the information that you see here, all types of CJI or CHRI, needs to be protected as sensitive information. One thing to note is that each state has their own laws pertaining to the information released based on a non-criminal justice records inquiry. Most states have forms or state background checks for purposes of employment, but national background checks have to go through the Office of the Attorney General. And as I mentioned, CHRI types of information can't be disseminated to the general public, and this includes maintaining CHRI in formats that are accessible by the public for maybe Freedom of Information Acts, because some of this might have to be released, but for the most part, these are need to be protected, as well as the CJI. A lot of times, you might hear people referring to CJI and CHRI using those terms interchangeably, but it's due to the comparatively sensitive nature, and additional controls are required for the access, use, and dissemination of anything that's considered CHRI, which you see down here. Now, one thing to note too, and this is the last comment for this slide, but CHRI is typically, when it's disseminated for non-criminal justice purposes, it should only be used for the purposes for which it was given. So in other words, users shouldn't be performing background checks to access criminal history record information on themselves for training purposes, or looking up someone they're dating, or something along those lines. So misuse of that information is considered a sanctionable offense if somebody is caught. Some more terminology that I'll be using, and then we'll get into the core of the presentation, but important for you to understand what these terms mean. So a CSA is a CJIS systems agency. And as I mentioned before, each state or territory has a CSA, which is a criminal justice agency that oversees administration and usage of the CJIS division programs within a particular state, district, or country. NCJA, I'll be using this term a lot today. So that's a non-criminal justice agency, which is an agency that conducts criminal history record checks on applicants for things like licensing or employment purposes. One thing to note is that there's typically two types of NCJAs. One is legally authorized to conduct state and national fingerprint-based background checks. And there's another that's qualified under what's called the Volunteer and Employee Criminal History System, which is used to conduct state and national fingerprint-based background checks, because they typically serve a more vulnerable population, such as like children, the disabled, or the elderly. Next up, we have what's called a LASO, or a local agency security officer. And a LASO actively represents their agency in all matters pertaining to information security when it comes to CJIS information. They have a lot of responsibility. They have to disseminate security information alerts, maintain information security documentation, assist with audits, and things of that nature. There's also something called a TAC, which is a terminal agency coordinator. So this should be the person that knows and understands the purpose of conducting the criminal history record check, and who should have access to the resulting information. Now, one thing to know is some agencies are small, and I've seen this before. So the LASO and the TAC might be the same person. It can be the same person, but you have to understand that if a TAC is also the LASO, they have to assume the responsibilities, which are pretty far reaching. They have to identify and maintain documents. I've listed some of these: maintain the policies, the security measures, make sure that the organization is compliant with the CJIS security policy. All right, so who does CJIS apply to? The CJIS security policy, or the CSP, applies to every entity and individual that uses, processes, stores, this is important, views, transmits CJI, or would operate in support of CJI services and information. So basically it comes down to all entities, whether they're a criminal justice agency or a non-criminal justice agency, that have access to any of the FBI's databases must adhere to the security standards. Now, when I talk about every individual, I mean that means contractor, private entities, non-criminal justice agencies, representatives. And I'm going to give some examples of these in a second, but it's more than just the employees of a non-criminal justice agencies in some cases. The whole purpose of the CSP is that it provides a minimum standard of security requirements and ensures continuity of information protection. So the essential premise of the CSP is to provide appropriate controls to protect all of that criminal justice information from creation through dissemination, whether it's at rest or in transit. Now, one of the requirements that the CJIS security policy puts forth is that entities must undergo compliance audit every 3 years. You're subject to it. I really don't know many agencies that have gone through it, but it's important that if you have the need to comply with this policy, that you make sure it's done, because you can be kind of randomly chosen to be audited. One thing you can see in the bottom, and I've kind of called this out, there's no such thing as CJIS certified. And what do I mean by that? So many vendors incorrectly state that their solution or their services are CJIS certified, but there's really no such thing as being certified in CJIS. There's no central CJIS authorization body. There's no accreditation pool of independent assessors or a standardized assessment approach when determining whether a particular solution is considered CJIS compliant. And as I mentioned before, each state is individually responsible for compliance within their jurisdiction. So that being said, since there's no single entity that can really bestow a national compliance seal of approval, and the FBI doesn't have the resources to run a national certification process. That's really why there's no CJIS certification. However, that said, third-party providers such as Compass can assist criminal justice agencies or non-criminal justice agencies in a risk assessment and help identify the gaps where controls may not be implemented, and then help you, offer ways to remediate some of those gaps. So what it comes down to is basically organizations can provide you with an assessment, and assessments can help determine if an organization is compliant at that point in time. But that being said, it's important to remember that compliance doesn't necessarily mean security either. Whether you're implementing the CJIS framework or NIST framework, PCI, whatever your organization has to comply with, security needs to be incorporated business as usual, and not just for the point in time that the assessment is conducted. So as promised, I said I was going to give you some examples of non-criminal justice agencies, and you can see the list here on the screen. So NCJIS. So basically, any company or entity with sensitive information or data coming from a CJIS database must be compliant with the CJIS standards. But there's a lot of agencies that maybe aren't directly related to criminal justice. They might submit fingerprints for, like I mentioned before, employment and things of that nature. So when you're thinking of non-criminal justice agencies, some of these are kind of obvious, some maybe not so much. So 9/11 communication centers can be considered a non-criminal justice agency. They might have the ability to view some criminal justice information or even see it on the screen. Banks can be considered non-criminal justice agencies. They might need access to that CJI for hiring purposes to run those background checks. A county school board. My daughter just went through this. She had to have her fingerprints done because she's going to be a teacher. So the county school board had to run her background and fingerprints to assist in employee hiring decisions. City and county IT departments, they can be indirect, they can have indirect access because they might provide support to servers or systems, computers that have that CJI information on them. They could be considered a non-criminal justice agency. Data centers might house criminal justice information. Departments of public safety, a lot of organizations outsource IT services. So those outsourced vendors may be considered non-criminal justice agencies, where they might need incidental access or viewing to that type of information for support purposes. Obviously, I think this one isn't a surprise. Prosecuting attorneys' offices, they probably are privy to quite a bit of information when it comes to litigation. Public school districts and charter schools. And this last one, probably one you wouldn't think about, but transcription and translation companies. So they would have the ability to view any of that restricted or confidential sensitive information. So those are all examples of non-criminal. It's not exhaustive, but I think it kind of gives you a good idea of the types of non-criminal justice agencies, what could be deemed an NCJA. So why is CJIS important? The security risk of both accidental and malicious attacks against government and private agencies remains persistent in both physical and logical environments. I mean, at any given day, you can go out to the media and take a look at organizations that have been breached. But when organizations are storing, processing, transmitting criminal justice information, the bad actors, that's like a golden gem to them. There's a lot of information that can be garnered from that type of information. But there's a lot of reasons why state and local government and even non-criminal justice agencies are becoming more frequent targets. State and local governments are typically less secure and less funded than their federal counterparts, so they might not have the resources or the funding to put controls in place. Government agencies are considered an easy target by bad actors for many reasons. Even small local agencies can provide the bad actors with the portal into highly sensitive data, right? We hear every day about how organizations are getting hit with ransomware because somebody clicks on a link that they weren't supposed to click. There's been an increase, so it's gone beyond the point of just using computers at a workstation. Law enforcement and other public safety agencies, or even private organizations, people are using their smartphones or their Apple Watches to access corporate information. So there's a lot of moving parts when it comes to ways that people can access information. Obviously, no surprise, over the last couple of years, the remote workforce has increased tremendously, which has created many challenges for IT personnel to secure those endpoints for remote workers. It just kind of expanded that footprint. So the overall, like if a bad actor gets access to CJIS information, it can be damaging to national security and the civil liberties of individuals. That's an obvious, I think. But further reaching than that is that if it does happen in your organization, it could lead to sanctions, penalties, things of that nature. The ultimate is that failure to comply could result in denial of access to those FBI databases. So you may not be able to run those background checks to check your employees. I've never heard of fines or criminal charges. I have heard of criminal charges, but not fines. That doesn't mean they don't happen, because not all of this is always publicized. In fact, back in 2019 in Fort Worth, hackers stole more than $15,000 from the city, and employees with criminal convictions were allowed access to a confidential FBI criminal database. So, you can imagine the ramifications of that happening. They can change records. Litigation would not go well for prosecutors. Just all kinds of issues with that. Basically the chain of custody has been broken on that, and the information's been tainted. But at the end of the day, the city could have ended up losing access to criminal justice information because they might have been violating several elements of that federal information security policy. So there's a lot to this. Even though it's not a law per se, it's a regulation and a framework, there are ramifications if the policy is not followed. All right, let's get into the good stuff. So criminal justice, the CSP, it's at version 5.9 right now, and that was as of June 1st of 2020. There have not been any updates. But the CSP itself emerged back in 1998, and it has evolved to this version. So I've worked with a couple of the different versions, and they try to stay up to date on new technologies and things like that. But what I can say, and what I do like about this policy, is that the CSP looks at the data, the services, and the protection controls that apply regardless of the implementation architecture. So in other words, it's architecture neutral. It can apply to any type of architecture. As I mentioned, there are 13 policy areas, which we're going to get into in a minute. But one thing that I do want to say is that local agencies can complement the CSP with a local policy, or they can develop their own standalone security policy. However, that being said, the CJIS, the CSP always has to be the minimum standard, and the local policy can augment or increase the standards, but not detract from them. So, as I stated before, the major theme of the policy areas are concerned with the electronic exchange directly with the FBI. However, it is understood that further dissemination of criminal justice information to authorized recipients by several various means, such as hard copy, email, web posting, whatever the case may be, does constitute a significant portion of CJI exchanges. So regardless of its form or use or method of dissemination, CJI requires protection throughout its entire life cycle, like I said before, from inception through destruction. The last thing I'll say is that before we jump into the policies, it's important to note that not every consumer of FBI CJIS services will encounter all of the policy areas. So therefore, the circumstances of applicability are based on individual agency configurations and use. So that's just something to keep in mind. I don't want you to be overwhelmed thinking you have to apply all of these policy areas. All right, so let's get into the policy areas. As I mentioned before, a lot of the CSP is based on NIST best practices. So some of the things that you see on the screen for the policy areas for CSP might look familiar, like security awareness training, incident response, physical security, and so on. So overall, there are roughly 588 controls contained within the CJIS security policy. The document, I have a link at the end of this presentation that you can go and download the document if you want some good bedtime reading. It's about 230 pages, which, yes, I did read the entire thing from front to back, multiple times actually. So there's a lot of information in there. And before we move on, I'm just going to say that there's a lot to unpack on the next several slides. So I'm only going to hit some of the highlights. Obviously, with the document that's 230 pages, I can't provide you with all of the information that's included in all of the policy areas, but the information that we are going to provide here today can be used for your reference after this presentation or in the future as a guide if it's something that your organization will need to implement or already implements. It's kind of food for thought, or if you need to present it to management, whatever the case might be. So obviously with 588 controls for 13 policy areas, the policies within the CSP are very granular. But again, keep in mind that not all of these policy areas and requirements are necessarily applicable to your organization. It all depends what type of CJI and or CHRI you're storing, processing, or transmitting. Okay, let's jump into the policy area. So the first one talks about information exchange agreements. Now, a lot of your organizations probably have NDAs or master services agreements and MSAs in place with various vendors if there's a need to exchange or view certain types of proprietary information, intellectual property, whatever the case may be. So the CSP has kind of their own terminology when it comes to things like that. So the first one is kind of along those same lines. So organizations that are exchanging CJI must have a signed written agreement between them. And this just documents policies and procedures, kind of who's responsible for what. It's just ensuring that both entities have the appropriate safeguards in place. You're going to see throughout each of the policy areas that there's a lot of documentation required, and that includes policy and procedures. It's really important to have updated policies and procedures for many reasons, which I'll get into in a little bit. But for this first one, you need procedures for handling, processing, storing, and communication of information to make sure all of that sensitive and confidential information is protected from unauthorized disclosure, alteration, or misuse. So in other words, only the people that need access to the data should have access to the data. And this is kind of like a high-level policy on how you're going to protect that information. Now, when we talk about a government non-criminal justice agency, such as a city IT department, which I mentioned before, they have to execute what's called this MCA. It's a management control agreement. And that basically just stipulates that management control of the criminal justice function remains solely with the criminal justice agency. So this is kind of like think of it as a support role, which I mentioned before. The IT department may not be directly connected to the criminal justice agency, but they're providing support for the agency. So therefore they need this MCA. When we talk about things like a public and non-criminal justice agency, like a school county board, or a private non-criminal justice agency, like a local bank, those types of organizations are typically requesting fingerprints or background checks of some sort. It's important that they have full consent of the individual for whom they're doing that background check before they actually do the background check. I think that kind of goes without saying, but it's important to comply with that regulation or that requirement. Any private contractors who perform criminal justice functions, so let's say you're outsourcing your IT, you're outsourcing the 911 call center, not only do they have to meet specific training requirements, but they also need to acknowledge and sign what's called a CJIS security addendum certification. And basically what that is, it's a uniform addendum to an agreement between the government agency and that private contractor, which will specifically authorize access to CJI or CHRI. It states the limit of the use of the information for the purpose for which it's provided. It ensures security and confidentiality of the information, and that it's conforming to the regulations of the CSP. And it also should provide for sanctions. Things like this, though, it's always good to have, if any of these things are being signed, it's always good to have your legal department review these and make sure that it meets legal needs as well as the requirements of the CSP. Now, I just threw a lot at you with all this terminology between the MCA and the security addendum, but the Appendix D of the CSP provides examples, some actually really good examples of these various types of information exchange agreements. So if these are things you have to put in place, that would be a good first place to go. Policy area 2 talks about security awareness training. So all users with authorized direct or indirect access to CJI. So I had mentioned these terms before, direct or indirect access. So let me clarify what that means. First of all, authorized personnel includes anyone who might have reason to access, view, handle, disseminate, or even destroy the criminal history, including people like administrative assistants or IT personnel who might only have an occasion to view that information. Those are all authorized personnel or should be authorized personnel. Direct access means personnel who access the CJIS system through a computer terminal, whereas indirect access would include personnel who are authorized to view maybe printouts that are sent to the agency as a result of say a fingerprint criminal history check. So that's the difference between direct and indirect access. However, that being said, all personnel, whether it's direct or indirect access, have to be trained. There's basic security awareness training, and that has to be done within 6 months of the initial assignment if they're going to be storing, processing, viewing, transmitting any type of CJI, and then every 2 years after. I also mentioned LASSOs before, the local agent security officer, or the TAC, if it's one and the same. There's additional enhanced training on specific duties, and they have to take that training annually. So when it comes to training, there's 4 levels of training, as you can see on the screen here. Now, what I want to say about this is that it's cumulative. So in other words, someone who's taken a level 4 is also going to get the level 3, 2, and 1. Someone taking level 3 will get 2 and 1, and so on. So level 1 training is for personnel who might have unescorted access to a physically secure location where CJI is being stored, processed, or transmitted. So for example, things like custodians or the cleaning staff, things of that nature. So it's a basic training, but still important. So it's important to understand exactly who is accessing or who will have the ability to be around any type of CJ information. And it's kind of, when you start thinking about who has access to your buildings, it can kind of, the list can become quite long. Level 2 training is for authorized personnel with access to criminal justice information. Level 3 is personnel with physical and logical access to criminal justice information. And then 4, this pertains to information technology personnel. And that's, think of like your systems administrators, security support staff, things of that nature. Again, I mentioned, I can't say this enough, it's really important to document. The CSP, like many other frameworks, is really big on documentation, whether it's policy and procedure, but it's important to keep records of security awareness training to show that authorized personnel have received the training when they are supposed to receive it. Policy area 3, this talks about incident response. So again, policy and procedure, it's important to have those documented, current, and up to date. You want to make sure your incident response plans include for adequate preparation, detection, containment, recovery, much like many of the other frameworks. Again, if you're familiar with NIST, incident response talks about all of this type of thing that you see on the screen. The CSP states in this policy area that where feasible, if you can implement automated mechanisms to support incident handling, do that where possible. It just kind of helps the flow of information. And if something happens, it's easier to gather that information for various reasons. Additionally, all employees, contractors, so pretty much everything you saw on that other slide, anybody who has access to the information have to be made aware of your procedures for reporting different types of events and weaknesses, and they need to be trained in the fact that any types of events or incidents have to be reported as quickly as possible to the designated point of contact, which is usually the last cell of the TAC. And then anybody who's involved with incident response, if you have an IRP team, incident response team, those people need to be made aware of their roles and responsibilities. Their job descriptions should also include that responsibility. And they typically require additional security awareness training. So there's a little bit more in-depth training for those involved on the incident response team, but from a general perspective, anybody who is involved with CJI also needs to understand what the procedures are for reporting such incidents. Policy area 4 talks about auditing and accountability. So auditing controls are typically applied to the components of an information system that provide auditing capabilities. So you want to think about things like servers, but they wouldn't necessarily be applied at the granular level to every single user level workstation within the agency. However, that being said, workstations do require other protections, which I'm going to talk about in one of the other policy areas. The important point of this is that you want to make sure that any of the systems that have to do with that whole CJIS information systems within your agency have the ability to generate these audit records. And the audit review, there should be an analysis and review of those logs and records at least once a week. And again, it's important that you document that you are doing that. This third bullet here, when it talks about the fact that audit records have to be retained for at least 1 year. So records have to be retained. They can be retained for longer than a year, but it's typically determined when they're no longer needed for things like administrative, legal, or audit purposes, or other purposes such as Freedom of Information Act, subpoenas, or law enforcement action. So obviously, that leads to the fact that you need some type of retention policy in place too, specifying how long information needs to be retained for. If there's subpoenas, you need to mark the audit records accordingly so that they're not deleted for potential litigation. These on the screen here, you can see that these are the types of things that have to be audited. And again, you need to keep those and review those once a week. So you want to look at things like login attempts, anything that might change or delete permissions on user accounts or files, or other system resources, attempts to modify or change passwords. You definitely want to make sure you're auditing and monitoring actions for super users or those privileged accounts. And then any attempts to access or modify any log files, that's important. Now, along with auditing these types of things, the actual audited events themselves have further requirements, and you have to make sure you capture things like the date and time of the event, the type of the event, the outcome, which is the success or the failure. So there's, like I said, these policy areas contained in the CSP. There's a lot more detail. I'm just giving you the very, very high level of these. So that's all I'll say to that one. And then policy area 5 talks about access control. So a lot of things to consider for access control. Access control overall provides the planning and implementation of mechanisms that can help restrict the reading, writing, and processing. So in other words, you want to just make sure it's either role-based or people who are authorized to have access to the information do. Logs, again, keeping logs of access privilege, you want to maintain those for a year or at least equal to the agency's record retention policy, whichever is greater. Anytime that CJIS is transmitted outside of the boundary of a physically secure location, that data needs to be protected with encryption. So for example, this means that even if an agency establishes a secure control room on separate floors of the same building, an additional system to perform encrypted email and file exchanges between the locations is necessary. So you want to, again, it's about the data in transit and the data at rest. One thing I want to note too, that, and I'm going to talk about cloud in a little bit, but I just want to mention it while I'm thinking of it, is that cloud provider email and file data cannot leave US-based servers. So if you are using cloud providers for your email and your data, you want to make sure that they're storing things on US-based servers. What else do I want to talk about here? System use notification. This is an important one. So information systems need to display an approved system use notification message before granting access, which is basically informing potential users of various usage and monitoring rules. So something, this is something you would probably want to run by your legal department, but you want to basically say that the user is accessing a restricted system. The system might be monitored and recorded, subject to audit, all of those good things that a system banner would typically include. Let's see, validation. System use, we talked about session locks and account locks. So session locks have to be in place for 30 minutes of inactivity, account locks for 10 minutes unless an administrator unlocks it. So again, a lot of information packed into this particular policy area, but important to understand nonetheless. And the last thing I'll say about this is that publicly accessible computers are not allowed to access, store, process, or transmit criminal justice information. And then I'm going to talk about bring your own devices. Many of those devices are not authorized to access, store, or process any CJIS information unless the agency has established and documented, again, there's that word documentation, specific terms and conditions, which is covered in policy 13. So a lot of information here, but again, very high level. Policy area 6 talks about identification and authentication. So every single person accessing any type of criminal justice information needs to have a unique identifier. And I think this should not be a big surprise, but basically what that comes down to is no shared accounts, right? Even for administrators, they have to have their own individual unique identification. There's several things packed into the password standards, which I think probably most of you on this call are familiar with, but the CSP has its own set of standards, minimum of 8 characters, has to expire within 90 days, can't be identical to less 10, so on. What I want to focus on here is this, what's called the advanced authentication policy. It's just a different term for multi-factor authentication. So the intent of this policy is to meet the standards of multi-factor authentication. But the key to this advanced authentication policy under the CSP is that the requirement to use or not use advanced authentication is dependent on the physical and technical security controls that are associated with the user location and whether criminal justice information is accessed directly or indirectly. So this advanced authentication is not really required for users requesting access to criminal justice information from within the perimeter of a physically secure location when the technical controls have been met. So conversely, if technical security controls have not been met, this advanced authentication policy is required from within a physically secure location. So I know that's confusing, but if you want to pick up the CSP and kind of read a little more on that, you can. Policy area 7 talks about configuration management, and this basically, so the highlights of this is that systems have to be configured to provide only essential capabilities. So in other words, you want to make sure that unessential ports and protocols are disabled and not enabled. And the big thing with this is you need a topological drawing. So the network topology has to be current and updated, and there's several requirements to this. It's got to show all communication paths. It's got to show the logical location of components such as firewalls, routers, switches, hubs. It doesn't have to be to the level of detail showing every single individual workstation, but it should show the number of workstations on that diagram. It should also be marked for official use only, and you should ensure that the agency name and date that the drawing was created or updated is also on there. Another important thing to note is that any types of drawings like this need to be protected from unauthorized access, because network diagrams contain a lot of information, and bad actors would love to get their hands on that, whether it's somebody, a nefarious actor on the inside or a bad actor trying to get your information. You just want to make sure your network diagrams are restricted on a need to know basis only. And then the last thing I'll say about diagrams is that it's really important to have updated diagrams and asset inventories, because if there were an incident or a breach, that's probably one of the first things forensics is going to ask you for, is your network diagram and a listing of your assets. So if there's going to be, obviously for forensic purposes, and then if there's going to be future potential litigation, it's just showing that your organization has done their duty of care and their due diligence. So really important to understand where your assets are. And I mean, my personal opinion is I think this whole thing should be policy number one, because if you don't understand where your assets are, or who's accessing that information, it's kind of hard to put the other controls in place. And that goes for whatever framework your organization is implementing. Policy area 8, we're getting there. Hopefully everybody's not, I still have everybody here. Okay, so this talks about media protection, and this is whether it's in digital format or physical format. So physical format is things like printed documents, printed pictures, diagrams, things of that nature. And obviously digital media covers the gamut, right? Things you want to make sure you're protecting any types of removable media, backup tapes, if people are still using tapes for backups, things like external hard drives, things of that nature. So overall, the premise behind this is that agencies have to secure data in all forms, whether it's digital or physical, both at rest and in motion. Again, document and implement your media protection policies and procedures. You want to make sure that you're storing physical and digital media within secure locations or controlled areas. If you have paper printouts, you want to make sure those things are locked somehow, securely locked. You want to make sure access is restricted to only those with a need to know. If you're transporting that media, you want to make sure there's anybody who's transporting that media is authorized to do so. Sanitization is a big one. So prior to reusing or disposing of any types of media, whether it's physical or digital, you want to make sure that it's properly sanitized. And again, this policy within the CSP talks about the various forms of sanitization. So you want to make sure you're using a secure form. Again, with this is a big one here, which is why I included this last bullet. You want to maintain written documentation of the steps that were taken to sanitize or destroy that electronic media. If you're using an outside firm, you want to make sure you get a certificate of destruction as well, but it's important that you document that. And again, a lot of this is kind of based on sanitization or destruction of media would be based on your retention policies. So it's important to have a retention policy in place too. Policy area 9 talks about physical protection. So again, you see policy and procedure, you need to document. This second bullet here that talks about the perimeter of a physically secure location shall be prominently posted and separated from non-secure locations. So this is kind of where you see something like this is a restricted area, authorized personnel only, others will be prosecuted, whatever. That's something that would have to be run by legal, but you want to make sure that physical areas that are processing, storing, transmitting any type of criminal justice information are segmented from, maybe like a public area, but it's got to be accurately posted. You also want to make sure you have an accurate, up-to-date list of people who are authorized to access that physically secure location. Many times physically secure locations have swipe badges or some kind of keypad, but you just want to make sure that the people who are accessing that area are authorized to do so. You want to control access to all physical access points, and that includes things like even wireless access points, right? Physical access points, it's a broad topic, but you want to make sure all of your physical access points are controlled. If you're using any types of transmission lines to transmit data, so let's say you have a VoIP system, which is the voice over internet protocol phone lines, you want to make sure your network closets for those are controlled. I've done several audits, not just for CJIS, but other audits where maybe the network closet is wide open. That's not a good practice by any means. This last one here, there's second to last one, position information system devices to prevent unauthorized individuals from accessing and viewing CJI. So I actually did an audit or an assessment for an organization. It was a bank, and they, when I did the audit, I realized that one of the main people who had all kinds of access to the FBI databases, their computer screen was facing the first floor window. So anybody looking from the outside in could potentially be able to view this information. I know it sounds silly, but at the end of the day, it's really not, because hackers take great measures to get whatever information they can. So I had just suggested things like a privacy screen for that particular computer, or move it away from the window. So kind of some innocuous things you may not necessarily think about, but they're important to take a look, which is sometimes why it's good to have like a third party come in and do that gap assessment for you. And then obviously you want to monitor physical access to information systems and have the ability to detect incidents and respond to physical security incidents. Policy area 10 talks about systems, communications, and protection. So any CJI transmitted or at rest outside of the boundary of that physically secure location needs to be protected via encryption. When we talk about controlling the flow of information between interconnected systems, what do I mean by that? So information flow control regulates where information is allowed to travel within an information system and between information systems, as opposed to things like who's allowed to access it. So you want to be able to understand how the information is flowing, if it's flowing between system, how it's being protected. It's basically how data moves from one place to the next in a secure manner. What else do I want to say on this slide? We've kind of talked about the VoIP network. So there's additional controls that have to be put into place for anything on a VoIP network that might contain unencrypted criminal justice information. Patch management is obviously a big one. You want to make sure your systems are patched with the most up-to-date patches. You want to make sure anything that's newly released is patched as quickly as possible, because again, that's an easy way for bad actors to take advantage of vulnerabilities in your systems if you're not installing the proper patches. You want to make sure you have things like malicious code protection, spam and spyware protection on your endpoints or any of the systems that are accessing that type of information. This last one, security alerts and advisories. A lot of organizations don't tend to do this, but this is kind of a big one for CJIS information. And so when it comes to security alerts and advisories, you want to make sure, and this would mostly fall on the responsibility of the LASO or the TAC that I had mentioned, who's that point of contact, but they want to make sure that they're receiving information system security alerts or advisories on a regular basis, whether that's however they do that. It's just important to get them. And then subsequently, they want to make sure that they issue the alerts and the advisories to the appropriate personnel, that they're sharing them with the appropriate personnel, so that if there's some type of 0-day, your IT department gets involved or your outsourced vendor gets involved, and you try to get those patches done as quickly as possible. A big thing with that is documenting the types of actions to be taken in response to those security alerts and advisories, because again, during the assessment or the audit, if the FBI comes in, you're going to have to show that, yes, we've been getting these security alerts and advisories. Here's what we've done. Here's what we've done to take action on those advisories. It was done on this date by this person, however you want to document that. So that's a really important one with this requirement. I had mentioned before that I was going to talk a little bit about cloud computing. Now, this is covered in policy section 10, and it's a pretty big section, but I just wanted to call out some of the more important things in here. A lot of organizations are transitioning to a cloud environment, for cost savings or whatever the case may be. But when it comes to the CJIS security policy, you want to be really careful if you are putting your information in the cloud. Again, you want to make sure they're on US servers, which is kind of what this bullet is talking about. It says the storage of CJI, regardless of the encryption status, should only be permitted in cloud environments which reside within the physical boundaries of the APB member countries. And APB stands for, it's the CJIS Advisory Policy Board. They're actually the ones that advise the FBI on, they kind of inform them of CJIS security policies and what should be done. However, these APB member countries include things like the US or US territories, Indian tribes, and Canada. So it's really important that you make sure that if you are going out to the cloud, that your information does reside within one of those APB member country physical boundaries. A lot of, at least from what I've seen, a lot of organizations that are accessing the CJIS database, one of the reasons why they typically don't put their information out in the cloud yet is because some cloud providers, depending on who they are, some of their archiving capabilities might not preserve the original data as expected, which could, like I mentioned before, kind of mess up that whole chain of custody, taint the evidence, and that could have a negative impact on future litigation. So that being said, how do you choose a reputable cloud service provider? The most important thing to garner from this is that you want to be sure that your potential cloud service provider has been audited by a state's CJIS system agency, which is that CSA. So that pretty much ensures at a minimum they've complied, and all of these things listed here are all listed in the CJIS security policy. So, but at a minimum, it's ensuring that they've done background checks on employees, that they've, set login attempts and set lock timers on sessions. They're using multi-factor authentication. They have that division of physical, the division of security between physical and virtual servers, things of that nature. So what I can tell you is that if you are in the cloud or thinking about going to the cloud with any type of criminal justice information, a lot of the larger cloud service providers have gone through the process of looking at the policy sets and saying that they are compliant with them. So there's other information you can look at. I know, for example, Microsoft signs the CJIS security addendum in states that have CJIS information agreements. And basically these tell state law enforcement authorities that are responsible for the compliance with CJIS, the CJIS security policy, how Microsoft's cloud security controls are helping to protect the full life cycle of data. And it's ensuring that appropriate background screening of operating personnel, they're following what they're supposed to be following. That said, though, Microsoft is continuing to work with state governments to enter into CJIS agreements. I know that they've signed agreements with nearly all 50 states. There's about 6 outlier states that they're still working on to actually, they're working with the state governments to get those CJIS information agreements in place. And again, I just want to reiterate that the FBI does not offer certification of Microsoft compliance with CJIS requirements. Instead, Microsoft, for example, will attest in included agreements between Microsoft and a state's security agency that they've complied with the requirements of the CJIS security policy. But again, all in all, I mean, what this comes down to for the cloud computing is having a solid vendor management program in place, which you should have anyways, regardless of whether it's CJIS or some other framework. It's always good practice because, as you've probably heard from a lot of the stories that we see in the media, many of the breaches occur through a third party. They're used as kind of the stepping stone to leverage their way into the intended target. Okay, a couple more to get through. Formal audits is covered in policy area 11, and this, we kind of talked about this a little bit, but the FBI CJIS division can every 3 years sample criminal justice agencies and non-criminal justice agencies. So that's basically what this policy area 11 talks about, is just the ability of the FBI to audit. But organizations, again, should be going through their own assessment at least annually when it comes to this type of sensitive and critical information. Policy area 12 talks about personnel security. So again, we've talked about this a little bit in some of the past slides, but you want to make sure that all personnel who have unescorted access to unencrypted CGI are background checked. If people leave the agency, you want to make sure that there's a process in place and you're documenting how you are immediately terminating that access to agency systems with access to CGI. Again, even if someone's transferring departments, you want to make sure that someone's on top of making sure that they have the proper access, or if they don't need it, it's immediately removed and that you're documenting that. You also want to make sure you have a formal sanctions process in place for anybody failing to comply with established securities and policies. Again, it's really important, no matter which one of these requirements we're talking about, there's a lot of documentation involved, and it's only going to serve beneficial to you in the long run. You don't want to play catch up with documentation. The last policy area is policy area 13, which talks about mobile devices. Now, this, if you read through the actual policy, this tends to refer mostly to what's called an MDT, which is a mobile device terminal in patrol cars. However, given the fact that so many organizations are using all different types of mobile devices, this is an important policy area to be aware of if your staff is accessing CJI through other types of mobile devices, whether it's, a lot of folks now have Apple Watches. So a lot of companies really don't think about that and consider that because they're like, oh, they're just accessing it from their phone. But, do they also have an Apple Watch that they're able to get alerts and things on too? It's a good idea to have an MDM, which is a mobile device management application or tool, so that if, let's say somebody is using their cell phone or some other type of mobile device and they lose it or it gets stolen, they report it immediately. There's a way for IT to immediately wipe that device so that the bad actor, whoever stole it, cannot get access to that critical information or systems. It's a good idea to develop, as you can see by this last bullet, develop enhanced or additional reporting and incident handling procedures to address mobile device operating scenarios, because timing is crucial on those. A couple more slides and then I'll take questions. So one of the supplements to this CJIS security policy is this requirement supplement. And this actually spells out every single requirement. But what I like about this, and the reason I wanted to show you this, is that it contains this requirement priority tier. So what does that mean? You can see the different colors here. So basically, the responsibility is color-coded within these columns based upon the agreed ability to perform the actions necessary and to meet requirements. So anything listed as a tier 1 requirement, those are in blue. And these controls have to be met by a system before you can even get a connection to the state system. So before you can even get access to the CJIS databases, you're supposed to have all of these things in place. Anything that's labeled a 2 in the gold, those have to be met by a certain date. Now, the additional colors over here, so this is basically a responsibility matrix, as some of you might be familiar with that terminology. So anytime you're in a cloud, and there's different types of cloud models that you can choose to use, which I'm not going to get into today, but I like this because it just kind of shows the responsibility. So this kind of serves as a responsibility matrix. So as you can see here, anything in dark green is the responsibility of the agency. Anything in dark blue is the responsibility of the service provider. Orange, it's indicating that it's the responsibility of both. And then anything that's in gray, that's the responsibility of, that's more of like the responsibility of the FBI, like they're allowing access, they approve access to get at the CJIS databases, things like that. So that's kind of, if you do happen to pull this supplement, I just wanted to give you a brief overview of all these colors and numbers and things of that nature. I will say though, the last thing I will say, at the end of the day, even though this responsibility matrix is here, it's ultimately the responsibility of the agency to ensure policy compliance. So even though it might say that the service provider is responsible for network infrastructure, shall control the flow of information. You want to make sure your service provider is actually doing what they're supposed to be doing, and that comes down to vendor management. I think I mentioned this before, but in that 230-page document, there are a bunch of really good references at the end, or appendices. So I just kind of outlined what some of these are. If you want to go right to these, they're pretty. Usually appendices to me are never really helpful, but these were really interesting, at least for me to read. So Appendix C gives you an example of some network topology diagrams. They do a really good job with that. I had mentioned before that there's some sample information exchange agreements, which you can find in Appendix D. Appendix F has sample incident response forms, which I found those to be actually really well laid out as well. So if you want to take a look at those. Appendix G is really useful. They have some really good information and best practices for things like virtualization or cloud computing, mobile, so on and so forth, all of these various topics. And then Appendix J was worth mentioning here because that is the non-criminal justice agency supplemental guidance. And then lastly, we'll be making this presentation available to everybody. I'm not sure how. Jeff can talk about that. I think Jeff talked about that, but these are some of the links to the information. The security policy itself is listed here. There's other resource links. And then I mentioned if you are using some of the major cloud service providers like AWS or Google or Microsoft, there's additional information on their websites and how they're complying with the CSP. Okay, that's it. I think I went a little bit over, but I'm going to try to take some questions here. Let's see. Is there a question? Is there a recommended technique for shared storage? Specifically, how does one go about certifying data destruction on a SAN? So without getting into a lot of detail, the CSP itself has some information on the accepted standards of destroying data, whether it's degaussing, purging, overwriting, things of that nature. It's all contained in that document.